When the Bible appears to teach two different things mutually exclusive to one another, we have to be careful which one we accept and which one we reject. They can't both be true, for they contradict each other. And the Bible, we've already seen, does teach that Jesus is God. We looked at 8 verses in particular, and we could have looked at quite a bit more, but that's what we looked at in previous videos, eight particular verses. Okay. Since the Bible does teach the deity of Jesus, as we've already seen, any verses we later find which appear to contradict this truth must have a different interpretation from their apparent meaning. So then, if the entire Bible teaches that Jesus is God, and it does, then certain individual verses which appear to conflict with the entire Bible, the main thrust of the Bible, must have a different interpretation from their apparent one. Okay, so that is how interpretation works. Let's look at some of those verses now which appear to teach against the deity of Jesus. In the Gospels, Jesus says that the Father is greater than he is himself. But, the argument goes, the Father is God, and so if Jesus is less than the Father, then Jesus is less than God. This is the first example I wanted to look at. Is the Father greater than Jesus? Jesus says so, and I can only agree with what Jesus says. But the real question here is not what Jesus said, but what Jesus meant by what he said. And the term greater is ambiguous. What does it mean? Think of human fathers. A human father, one could say, is greater than his human son or daughter. But they are both humans, and all humans are equal in respect to being equally human people. Yet the human father has greater authority than his child. The child is supposed to obey the father. I submit to you that Jesus, as the Son of God, is equal to Jehovah with respect to divinity, yet subordinate to the Father with respect to authority and parenthood. In other words, Jesus, as God's Son, is supposed to obey what his Father says. Note that the text of the Bible itself does not specify in what respect the Father is greater than the Son. Therefore, since we already know from the entire Bible as a whole that Jesus is equally divine, the subordination of Jesus to the Father must be in some respect other than deity. The basic interpretive principle is as follows. If there are two possible understandings of a text and one conflicts with other biblical passages, go with the understanding that is consistent with the Bible. Your reading is that Jesus is not God. My reading is that he is God. The Bible contradicts your reading, so my reading is correct. And in general, of course, there could be more than two possible interpretations, so I'm assuming here that there's only two, but there could be in practice more than just two. Next, consider Colossians chapter 1, verse 15. Jesus, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. Before addressing the second part of that verse, I wish to emphasize the beginning half of it. Jesus, we there read, is the image of the invisible God. What does this mean? God is Jehovah. Jehovah is invisible. We can't see him, but we can see Jesus. The clear teaching of the Bible from beginning to end is that idolatry is a sin. We are not to make a graven image of God, Moses tells us. It seems the reason for this prohibition, in part, was because Jehovah is too big to represent with a statue. It would leave too much of God out. And yet Jehovah himself made a graven image. That graven image is Jesus. Will Jehovah violate his own law? Of course he will not. The only way to make sense of all this is to suppose that the graven image, Jesus, is himself God. It is not a sin for God to be God. In other words, if Jesus is the image of the invisible God, then Jesus simply is God. But God is eternal and thus not the first creature. Moving along, the first thing I'd like to note about the first part of the verse, actually the second part of the verse, the firstborn of every creature, is that it says that Jesus is not the first creation of God, but it says instead that Jesus is the firstborn of God, or the firstborn of every creature. This alerts us to the fact that we cannot be overly literal in our interpretation of this verse. And Jesus is not literally born to the Father through normal human reproduction. And as a matter of fact, in Strong's lexicon, the term firstborn includes a figurative meaning within the definition. The Greek word is prototokos and means firstborn, comma, literally or figuratively. That's the definition, so it can be a figurative firstborn. It's number 4416 if you want to look it up for yourself. And again, that's in Strong's Greek lexicon. Secondly, we ought to allow Scripture to interpret Scripture. A few verses later, in Colossians chapter 1, verse 18, we find out the meaning of firstborn in this context, in the context of Colossians 1. So about halfway through verse 18, we read, quote, "The firstborn from the dead," Jesus is the firstborn from the dead, "that in all things he might have the preeminence." So Jesus, according to verse 18, is not the firstborn with respect to all creation. Instead, he is the firstborn with respect to the dead. That is to say, the resurrection first fruits. Jesus rose from the dead first and will follow him in the general resurrection at the end. He was the first to be resurrected, not the first to be created, as verse 18 makes clear. And verse 15, going back to verse 15, then the every creature in verse 15 are human beings waiting for the general resurrection, human bodies waiting for the general resurrection. This is the same every creature we are to preach the gospel to. We don't preach the gospel to rocks and trees and animals. So Jesus in Colossians 1 is the firstborn. In other words, he was resurrected first, and we will be resurrected after. And also in verse 18, it says that he is to have the preeminence in all things. But only God, I submit to you, should have the preeminence in all things. So we see here again, Jesus was not created. He is not the firstborn in that sense, that he came into existence, and he has the preeminence in all things. Jesus is God. And the third passage I wanted to look at is John chapter 3, verse 16. In that verse, Jesus is referred to as the only begotten Son of God. The Greek term here is monogenes, number 3439 in Strong's. It is there defined as only born, that is sole, S-O-L-E. So God's solitary Son would thus be a better translation than only begotten. But if we say that Jesus is God's solitary Son, there's nothing necessarily about a beginning in that better translation. If the Father can be eternal, then so can't the Son. But if Jesus can be eternal, then he can be God. And again, we see Jesus is God. These verses do not show that Jesus began to exist or that he is less divine than the Father. So they do not prove that Jesus is not God. Thank you. Shalom.